Wolf Pack, what is going on? It's your boy, the Wolf of Roto Street, RotoStreetJournal.com. We breed and feed you fantasy wolves here, and so pumped to be breaking down on the eve of the draft, just a few hours away. We are going to preview everything by coming up with our quote-unquote fantasy wish list for the draft, breaking down some of the top landing spots for prospects and who would be the ideal rookie fits to go there. Now, we'll, of course, break down who these prospects are, why we like them, where they're fitting in. But we're not going to get overly analytical. We're just going to be looking more so, again, at these available targets, these explosive offenses that might need a big weapon and all those different pieces and what would be tonight. We're leaving and just jazzed up about where these rookies or potential trades have unfolded. So I cannot wait to dive into this. I think it's a unique way to kind of get ahead and get just jazzed up for the draft tonight. I'm stoked. It's like the NFL season's here. My man Mo, how are we feeling today, brother?
Oh, I'm really fired up. I mean, first taste of anything NFL related since the Super Bowl, outside of just throwing in these best ball drafts. And this draft's gonna have a lot of fantasy implications. I mean, there could easily be like 12, 15 wide receivers that go in the first 100 or so picks. So there's gonna be a lot of guys that we have to sort through, deal with, and determine what their landing spot means, what the draft capital means. And it's going to be a lot of work in the next coming weeks, just trying to piece through how all these rosters will look when these rookies show up to town. But I'm looking forward to it. The draft's the NFL new calendar for a lot of fans. Yeah. Like not so much you and I included. I mean, we've been kind of going at this for a little while now, but I'm still really pumped up, looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And you alluded to receivers and anybody that's been studying this draft. And if you're new to it, the big buzz is this is one of the most historic receiver classes. And I've been diving deep this last 2 weeks or so, really the whole offseason, but definitely these last few weeks into podcasts and tons of articles. Love Scott Barrett's breakdowns. Love all the Fantasy Life podcasts they've been pumping out with some great guests. So I feel pretty well versed in this class now, and kind of what everybody's the guys I really respect and trust, what they're saying about this receiver class is it's historic at the top. The big three, there's no arguing. They're three of the best prospects to come out in the last 5 to 10 years. All of them would have been the number one guy last year, the year before. Even Rome, who's often considered the third guy, would have been that top prospect across the last three classes. But then after that, it is a little bit of a mixed bag. Who is the number 4 guy? Where are they going to fall to? There are little warts to some of these guys. So some are saying that it's a little bit overrated of a receiver class, and all the other buzzes, it's a running back class that's dreadful. And yet a lot of people are talking about how Jonathan Brooks in any other class, if he wasn't coming off that ACL injury, would have been towards those top tiers. And then there's some really exciting athletic profiles behind him that could land in some interesting spots. So the whole macro view before we start diving into some of these dream spots is maybe the receiver class, besides the big three, a little overrated. Maybe the running backs slightly underrated here. And we're going to break down where they could land and flourish either way. And we're, as you can see by the banner, the dream spot right now is the Buffalo Bills, the ultimate, what I like to call value hole. A lot of people just call it landing spot, but where is there just some available volume, some money production potentially up for grabs? And to me, there's nowhere better than the Bills. One, you of course have Josh Allen, and that certainly never hurts to have a cannon arm like him that we've seen produce receiver one after receiver one season out of Stephon Diggs. Now Stephon Diggs is gone. They have vacated 3,353 air yards, by far the most in the league, because you also add in the fact that Gabe Davis is out of there too. That's 73% of their air yard share. That's the most in the league as well. 317 targets, second most. 54.7% total target share, second most, but a whopping 87% of their wide receiver target share is now up for grabs. So there is no better spot for a wide receiver to land, in my opinion, than the Buffalo Bills. Of course, they're drafting a little bit later, so we're looking at some of the, I don't want to say lesser prospects, but ultimately it's unlikely that a guy like Rome Odunze would go there unless, and we're talking wish list. So I started off that if the Bills get crazy, and we've seen Bean, he is not afraid to wheel and deal and make moves, would not stun me if he decides to pull off like a 2 first-rounders, a second-rounder the next year as well type of deal to get into that top 10, land one of those guys. In my opinion, it'd probably be Rome there sitting at 10, maybe with the wide receiver now, Rich Bears sitting there at 9. Maybe, just maybe, the Bears and the Bills work something out. My number one wish list would be Rome Odunze, an absolute monster, the number one receiver in any other class the last 3. So good in the contested catch, so good at every layer of the field, can do every single route. it'd be like a souped up Stephon Diggs at this point, in my opinion, if he landed there with the Bills. That is my ultimate wish list. We'll dive into some more realistic ones as well. But could you picture something like, what would your reaction be to Rome Odunze or one of those big three somehow landing with Josh Allen and the Bills?
I mean, they're going to skyrocket up draft boards. It's an instant wide receiver 2 in terms of fantasy type of guy. I mean, you can't discount the number 1 wide receiver for Josh Allen, regardless of who it is. And I would be very excited if it's Odunze. I mean, any of those big three guys. I mean, I don't know how realistic it is. I mean, obviously,
this is a wish list, Mo. We're dreaming here.
Yeah.
We'll go to realistic guys. We can pour some cold water on it. But you said wide receiver 2. If Rome, one of the big three, end up there, I would say top 5 ceiling, not just wide receiver 2. Like, I would lock any receiver that lands with the Bills, if it's one of the big three, into my top 10, and I wouldn't think twice. So
wow.
Other guys, maybe not. And I do agree with you that, regardless of who lands there, it's going to probably be a wide receiver 2, even if it's one of the later round guys. But man, if it's one of those big three, I would not have them any lower than wide receiver 10, in my opinion.
That is, I mean, we'll cross that bridge if and when we get there. But that is that is an interesting take to have. But I mean, like, I can't really argue it either. I mean, the top 3 guys would be number 1s in different classes. I mean, depending on the year, of course. And with Josh Allen on their side, yeah, they've got top 10 potential for sure. But I mean, personally, we can move on to some of the more realistic guys that I think the most realistic trade up situation, if the Bills do trade up to get a receiver, I think it's Brian Thomas Jr. And I think Malik Nabers, number 2, or the number 2 alongside Malik Nabers at LSU last year. And I've seen some mocks from some respectable guys. I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Daniel Jeremiah last night. His final mock had Thomas slipping all the way to the Bills without them having to trade up at all. So
Mel Kiper had that too, by the way. Yeah, I've seen it. If that happens, I'm with you as a realistic spot. Continue forward, but I've seen that too, and it gets me also quite excited too.
Yeah, and he's definitely, like, if he wasn't playing alongside Malik Nabers, I mean, who knows what he would produce. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of, like, teammates eating into each other in terms of their college production and what that means in terms of them as a prospect. So I don't really want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but I mean, what could have been with Brian Thomas without Nabers there? I mean, I think he's a quality all-around receiver. He's pretty big, just about 6'3", 200 pounds. I mean, I think he's quality all around. I think if he lands in the right spot, especially the Bills, I wouldn't be too shocked if he's a top 15 receiver right off the bat when BBM opens up. I mean, if he lands in Buffalo, he's going to be skyrocketing up draft boards. And another name that I think will be coming up draft boards if he ends up in Buffalo. I mean, just about any name is going to be coming up draft boards.
Whoever ends up there is going to skyrocket. Yeah.
Another guy that I think is going to be, like, truly skyrocketing would be A.D. Mitchell. I mean, we've talked about him in the past as being a good fit for Josh Allen in Buffalo. We talked about him being a good fit even before Stephon Diggs was traded to the Texans. So I think that would overall, he's the big physical receiver. I mean, the analytics don't love him, but the tape really loves him, and just, like, the physical profile, the speed, the size combo. It profiles to be a guy that just I don't want to say Gabe Davis, but just, like, the type that Josh Allen's not afraid to get the ball down the field for him for these massive looks. And he has the physical talents to capitalize on him. And I think in the Bills offense that could be highly explosive. And one guy that you like, and I think is a good fit, but I'm not as high on, is Ladd. What do you like about Ladd going to Buffalo?
Oh, you're giving my guy away. I do want to address, I'll get to Ladd in a second, but I first want to address, if it is Brian Thomas, I think that's a great call. That would be my semi-realistic. Of course, the dream of dreams, again, is Rome trading up, something crazy. And I give it a 3% chance. I don't say it's a complete, wouldn't bring it up if I thought there was absolutely 0% chance just because of Bean's history. But yeah, I do think whether it's moving up for Thomas or if these mock drafts pan out and he does fall to them, Brian Thomas would be absolutely perfect. Many calling him the best deep threat of this class because of the size, because of the speed, a 9.98 RAS score, like top 1 percentile in terms of athleticism and deep production. And he didn't have a ton of deep looks. Only 20% of his looks came from down the field. But you pair that up with a Josh Allen cannon arm, and there's still a lot more of his game that could be developed. Scott Barrett did tweet out that 76% of his yards in production came on just 2 routes, like the deep go and hitches. And so, yeah, it might be a little bit of a limited guy that needs some refinement, but this is the type of offense that skill set can absolutely flourish. So I would love to see Brian Thomas go there. I do think he has the ability to develop into more. It reminds me kind of the A.J. Brown and DK Metcalf type when those two guys were on the same squad. In fact, it was Scott Barrett who brought that comparison that DK Metcalf had 76% of his yards on just those two routes throughout college, and we've seen him certainly develop into something special. So I would love to see Thomas there. I do think that's the best of the quote-unquote realistic fits. I do like A.D. Mitchell as well, but the more I've been studying up on it, the more I've been hearing the analytics, the worst yards per route run of anybody projected to go in the first round of the last 5 years. The yards per team target pass attempt, Dwayne McFarland, one of my favorite analysts, likes to cite that, and that's also the worst of any potential first-round receiver. So there's a lot of weird, if he's this good, if he's that much of an athletic freak, which he is, you can't argue the numbers. The guy is, just like we talked about Brian Thomas being a top 1 percentile athlete, so is A.D. Mitchell. He's an absolute freak. And the tape, he does these things and these moves that are so special for a body of his size. And then you just wonder, why is he not more consistently getting the ball? And why is he just not dominating more often in big games and playoff games? He has a touchdown in all 5 of his playoff games. So he did show up in big moments. It just, where is this discrepancy? Why is it happening? But man, if there's anywhere that's going to squeeze the most out of him, it would be the Bills. So should he land there, of course, I'm going to love A.D. Mitchell. But that's one of the few spots that I really feel I would start to go all in on him. I did put Ladd, and I am just in love with Ladd myself, because everybody, and a lot of people are seeming to wake up to the fact that this is not just a slot like Wes Welker, Julian Edelman type of guy. 4.37 speed. His RAS score surprised a lot of people. And when you watch the tape, he did dominate down the field at every single layer of the field. Obviously, so good in the intermediate game and the short game as well, getting off the line, getting open. He can do all those Cooper Kupp and Puka type of layup routes and be that guy that could just hog in 100 catches no matter where he lands. But then also to pair that ability to separate and get deep with an arm like Josh Allen, I could see him easily catching 105 balls. He could do just what Stephon Diggs was doing right from the get. And I don't see another guy going in that later first, early second range that has such a complete skill set, so dependable, so reliable as Ladd McConkey. So it seems like he's kind of an unsexy guy for a lot of people at first glance, because he doesn't have that true, 1 percentile athleticism. But man, the way he can just win at every single layer, how reliable he's been, and just all the buzz this week has been how a lot of NFL scouts seem to like him more than the analytics and draft community do right now, just because of the workman-like mentality, the way that he has been so reliable, and he is a gym rat type of guy. So the Cooper Kupp comparisons are pretty valid by a lot of people according to that. And I could just see him becoming Josh Allen's go-to layup guy like Diggs has been. So it doesn't seem like the Brian Thomas dropping bombs going crazy, but actually a more complete guy that could really round out and be a true wide receiver 1 for them. I'd love to see Ladd land there.
I mean, yeah, he's really good off the line of scrimmage. I mean, can get open quickly and just generally a solid, polished route runner. I mean, he definitely has that. He makes up for the lack of the physical attributes. I mean, he's still a very talented athlete and gifted. I mean, just not to the degree of like an A.D. Mitchell that we've been talking about. But I mean, he makes up for it with just being good at the game of football. I mean, he's going to be able to come into an offense right away, and especially an offense like Buffalo. I mean, like I just said, he's great off the line of scrimmage, and that being good off the line, being able to get open quickly, it's what leads to those 120 target seasons. I mean, I don't want to say he's going to do that in his rookie season, but I mean, that's the kind of skill set that you find for just those high volume guys. So being with the opportunity that's available in Buffalo, I mean, if that's where he ends up, yeah, there's no reason not to get excited about it.
The other reason too, I love the fit was a stat I heard against the zone coverage. He ultimately averaged a 26% target share, which was more than even Marvin Harrison. He just knows how to find those soft spots, and a lot of teams play zone against the Bills at a high clip. And just in general, it's a 70% rate of the NFL in terms of zone coverage. He's the best zone beater in this class, and especially when you're facing a quarterback like Josh Allen, a lot of teams will drop those safeties, play those zone pockets. He finds those soft spots as well, Ladd McConkey. So I would just go nuts if he ends up landing there. But I do think, again, the athleticism of Brian Thomas would be so intriguing. And should they trade up, it would be crazy. Now, a team that does not have to trade up, that's sitting at the top of the draft, we've got 2 of them coming back to back here that we're going to talk about. The first being the Cardinals, who are reportedly open for business right now and are interested in moving down. Should they not, though, at number 4, they're going to have their pick of the litter of this big three that, again, I believe and everybody believes is one of the best big three to come out in maybe ever in terms of how these three could pan out for this year. So the Cardinals, we've seen Kyler Murray, a very valid quarterback, and that's what I also love about the next spot we're going to talk about. It's not just that there's so much open opportunity. There's actually a quality quarterback on the other end of things slinging the rock, because we could talk about the Patriots and who knows who their rookie will be, and there's going to be some open spots for volume, but in terms of actual quality volume, the Kyler Murray show should be a quality one for whoever lands there. We've seen it for DeAndre Hopkins, for Marquise Brown, before last year's disaster for Brown. He has been peppered, their wide receiver ones, Kyler Murray has, for nearly 11 targets a game since he's been the quarterback there. So I love whoever lands there. And for me, and I'm guessing for you as well, nobody would be a better fit than just Marvin Harrison, the ultimate pro-ready receiver, who I loved his quotes this week where he was talking about, why didn't you do the combine this week? I didn't want to work out. I wanted to actually get better at the game of football. Been meeting with veterans about their craft, how they get off the line. It's like that Kenny Powers quote. I'm not here to be the best at exercise, and I'm here to dominate the game. I absolutely love that about Marvin Harrison. He has that dog mentality. He is so pro-ready, and he'd be the perfect guy to just walk in here, give the ultimate weapon to Kyler Murray, walk on day one to see 150 type targets situation. I'd love to see Marv land here. I think he'd be the perfect weapon, perfect mesh with Kyler Murray. They also have the tackle there, Paris Johnson, who's talked a lot about how he wants his old Ohio State boy to link up with him. Marvin behind the scenes apparently loves the Cardinals as well, as hoping that's where he goes. So good vibes all around. I hope that's where he lands. I'd be super stoked to see it. What do you think, though, for the Cardinals? Do you agree with me that Marv would be the guy you'd like to see go there?
I mean, yeah, I've kind of mentally had this as a shoe-in for a while now. I mean, just kind of assuming that that's going to be the case. And like you said, it's a valuable, regardless of the talent of Marv. Like I think he's obviously proven that physically and just as a football player in general, he has all that he needs to succeed. But outside of his talent, it's a valuable landing spot in and of itself. I mean, we saw DeAndre Hopkins come fresh off a PED suspension and get like 12 targets for like 3 straight games. Like, I don't know if you remember that. It was right when he came back from suspension. It was double-digit targets for like 3 or 4 games in a row. It was just, we've seen it time and time again with Kyler Murray, at times Hollywood Brown. He's more than willing to pepper the number one guy, and he'll have some competition with Trey McBride, and maybe they even add another guy in the later rounds, because that wide receiver room is pretty thin with just Greg Dortch and Michael Wilson there, outside of presumably Marvin Harrison. And I know you've been grabbing some Greg Dortch late just because of the lack of competition in that wide receiver room. So I'm excited. Like, it's mild competition with an up and coming guy in Trey McBride. So he should just command all the targets. And like you said, there's just nothing to not love about Marvin Harrison. Just the physical traits. He didn't need to run. I mean, we know what he's getting. He's just gifted physically, and just as a football player, he's obviously the best guy. And that's coming from a mildly biased opinion. I know there's some debate as to who's the wide receiver one, but I think it's clearly Marvin Harrison Jr. And mentally, I've had him shoot in as a Cardinal for a little bit now. So yeah, I'm excited for it. And when I'm getting Marv in best ball, I'm stacking him with Kyler Murray every time when I can, unless he gets sniped from me. So that tells you what I think about what the Cardinals will be doing. I mean, that should say enough.
Yeah, I've been doing the same, and I've been drafting him right in the smack dab middle round 2 right now, hoping and assuming that he is going to be going there to the Cardinals. I think it's going to be a beautiful fit. So pro ready. It's going to be great.
How far do you think he falls if it's not Arizona where he ends up? Because that's probably, like, unless he like somehow ends up in Los Angeles, that's like the most obvious dream landing spot for a wide receiver prospect. Where do you think he falls if it's not Arizona?
Yeah, and we'll talk about LA in just a second. I do think, and I have seen this on a couple mock drafts, and just the buzz of the idea that they are open for business, the Cardinals, and maybe that is where the Vikings sneak in to get J.J. McCarthy, and ultimately that would leave the Chargers sitting there at number 5, but they've already talked about how they want to go tackle. I don't know if they could possibly pass up on Marvin. That would be a great number. I mean, maybe even better than the Cardinals spot. We're going to talk about why the Chargers is so sexy in just a second. But if they passed, there's no way the Giants would pass. They need – what's that?
Like a best ball, like his ADP.
So if he's with the Cardinals, he's going to be right there in mid-round 2. The only issue I do potentially see, though, is let's say They trade, a quarterback gets drafted at 4, and then the Chargers pass on Marv, and he's sitting there, and there's no way that the Giants end up passing. Not on this wish list. Like, we're talking about more so where we want to see people go. But I guess part of a wish list would be, where do we want to see people avoid? Where do we not want to see them land? Sure, Marv is good enough to certainly produce no matter where he lands, as is Nabers, as is whoever. But the Giants are hideous. I mean, they have not had a quality wide receiver, maybe because it's the talent, sure, but Daniel Jones is not intriguing at all. And if they are not taking a QB in round 1, it means that quarterback situation is still going to be hideous come next year. So that scares me. That's the one reason right now where I'm like, oh man, I could see Marv taking a decent hit, is if they ultimately trade out of 4 and then he falls all the way to 6 and goes to the Giants. That would be horrible. That's also where I'd like to see all these big 3 wide receiver prospects ultimately avoid, is in New York, because that's one of the few spots at the top of the draft. It's a death hole, in my opinion. And sure, they'd be okay because they're talented enough, but there's so much more value to going to the Cardinals, or potentially going to our next value hole. Our next discussion is the Chargers. And now I label this as the top target earner, not just the wide receiver 1, because I'm not sure it has to be a wide receiver they end up taking. In fact, when you look at the Greg Roman offense paired up there with Jim Harbaugh, we all know is now there in the Chargers, this offense has actually typically been through the running game and then peppering the actual tight end down the seams. And yes, okay, Mark Andrews, I get it. He's going to dictate the targets because he's so damn talented. But you also can go all the way back to their 49ers days together. Vernon Davis had 14 touchdowns. I mean, he was absolutely a key cog in this offense. But I also don't think it's a death knell for receivers, because you can look at all the stats, and it isn't great. The fact that they have been bottom 3 in pass attempts in every single year of Greg Roman calling plays, number 1 to number 3 in rush attempts in all of those years as well. You can obviously see why that would flip, and we'll talk about running backs in the Chargers for just in a little bit here when we get to the running back position. But ultimately, there have been typically the wide receiver 1, and it was Crabtree back in the day. He still had some pretty big years where he saw 127 targets. He saw, the next year 140, 115. So he still was getting himself some decent volume, but it would not be the sexy spot, assuming that the Greg Roman offense remained the same. But I don't know that we can just make that assumption. A great article over on Established Run talked about he's never had a quarterback like Justin Herbert at his disposal, Jim Harbaugh or Greg Roman. So ultimately, I do think it could be a great spot for Malik Nabers. That's the guy I'd love to see go there at number 5, just because he also fits what we've seen this offense like to do. They give a lot of quick hit designed yak opportunities, and Nabers is an absolute animal in those spots, but also they love to establish the run to then get the play action and open up those deep shots. We know he can also nail those down as well. So I think Nabers would be a beautiful, beautiful landing spot here with the Chargers, because of course it's Justin Herbert, and his wide receiver 1 is going to make some noise in fantasy. Although I said top target earner again, because if it's Brock Bowers there, because maybe they do trade out of 5, everybody talking about how they'll probably take a tackle if they do stay, Joe Alt potentially landing there, but maybe they do end up pulling that deal. So JJ McCarthy goes to the Vikings, and they trade down to 11, and then maybe Bowers. A lot of people saying he might fall out of the top 10, despite being maybe the best prospect at any position in this entire draft. If he should land there, we've seen Greg Roman hammer the tight end position. This is one of the most elite tight end prospects. I would probably rank him as a top 6, 7 at worst tight end, should he end up being, because he would be the top target earner, assuming that I don't even know who else they could draft later on in the draft that would actually threaten Bowers should they take him at 11 and he's there. So whether it's Nabers, whether it's Bowers, I'm hoping one of those guys lands there for the Chargers, gives Justin Herbert a monster weapon. Those are the 2 I'd love to see go there. What about you, Mo? Who would you really like to see land with the Chargers?
I would love to see both Nabers and Bowers, but in a lot of the more recent, like the last not even 24 hours since yesterday afternoon, I'm seeing a lot of JC Latham going to the Chargers in the first round, even at number 5, or if they trade back to 11. So I'm operating, and I for the last 3 weeks, we talked about it in our initial value holes show a couple of weeks ago. I've been operating on the assumption that they're going tackle with their first pick, whether it be at 5 or 11. So I've been really honing in on they hold the number 37 pick early in the second round. So I've been looking at those guys for guys that I'm trying to project to be the future Chargers guys. And we've talked about A.D. Mitchell, so I don't really need to talk too much about him, but he could easily be there at 37. I mean, he's projected to be a late first round guy, so a slip down to 37 isn't completely out of the completely out of the realm of possibility. Can't not mention Roman Wilson with the Harbaugh Michigan connection. I mean, it's I'm not the biggest fan of him, but I mean, he's an all-around guy.
Shocker.
Yeah,
Bias over
there.
there.
There's an Ohio State logo right behind me.
Not the biggest fan of JJ McCarthy or Roman Wilson or Blake Corum or Jim Harbaugh's a dickhead.
yeah. That's basically what I'm getting at here. But I mean, like, you can't not mention Wilson potentially going there at 37. But another guy that was originally, like, early in the draft process was pretty highly liked by a lot of people, or at least liked more than he is now, is Troy Franklin. He's slipped a lot since he went through testing, and just his speed wasn't quite where people wanted it to be, and the size. And so he could easily be there at 37, and that would definitely be a pick that would get me excited. And people wonder whether or not he can be a true X receiver, or if he's just like a pure deep threat, like vertical guy. I mean, I think there's the analytics love him, and I think there's a legitimate chance that he could just be one of those steals, like early second round receivers that kind of just slips a little bit, and a quality team like the Chargers. Who knows if the Chargers give me a quality team, but he's got a quality quarterback at a minimum in Justin Herbert. So I would definitely be excited if he lands with the Chargers, because that's the framework that I'm operating on now. Even with this JC Latham stuff, like, he's like sprung all the way up to number 5 potentially. So I'm assuming that they're going tackle there and thinking they're going to grab their receiver in the second round, because they're going to have to grab a receiver. There's no way you're going to go into a football season with Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnston as your top 2 guys. And so something is going to happen, and I think that'll be more in the second round. So when I'm trying to grab my Chargers guys, I'm looking more to the Troy Franklin, Mitchell, Roman Wilson type.
Yeah, and this spot is so juicy in terms of opportunity. 2,672 air yards is the second most, behind only the Bills, as we talked about. 57.9% of the air yards, also number 2, only the Bills. But 395 total targets is number 1 in the league in terms of open opportunity. And I know it will be a different offense. It will be a different style of game, but there is plenty of meat on this bone to pick. And we saw it last year with the Texans, the Packers, the Lions, with these huge vacated open pies. The Lions were a couple years ago when they drafted Amon-Ra St. Brown, a round 2 guy, or round 3 even, where he went. So ultimately, like, that open vacated volume is so important, especially when it's coming from a quarterback like Justin Herbert. I think the Troy Franklin call is a great one. Should it not be Malik Nabers? Not that Franklin is a Malik Nabers, not even close, but they are a similar build in the sense that Troy Franklin, when he gets the ball, he does become a runner. He's quick, he's shifty, he's nimble. I know he's smaller than Nabers, he's not as thick and sturdy. And he could also take the ball. He could take the top off the defense and get deep too. So he's almost, I don't want to call him a poor man's Nabers, but a lot of Devonta Smith comps I've seen, and I like that a lot, because he is that slimmer build. But we've seen guys, whether it's Tank Dell, Devonta Smith, who we just shouted out, it doesn't have to be that huge big body X anymore in the league to be a true number 1. And I'd be very intrigued to see Troy Franklin. Should he be the guy they go with? They go round 1 lineman and then ultimately go for him in round 2. I think that would be a beautiful landing spot. And he fits, again, what that offense wants to do in terms of yak opportunities, and then set up the play action deep shots with that run game. So whether it's a big early weapon in that top 5 to 11 spot, wherever they end up going, if it's a Bowers, if it's a Nabers, amazing. But round 2, yeah, I think Franklin would be among my favorites to see land there. I think that's a really, really interesting call out. And we talked about Bowers and how he is just one of the best tight end prospects to ever come out, and certainly one of the best overall prospects in this class, despite tight ends getting a little more devalued as receivers have been continuing to climb up as a whole in the NFL. I do think the Chargers is, of course, the number 1 spot with the Roman scheme, with the open vacated volume. All of that is great. But if it's not him, a team I've seen him often mocked to that I do really like is the Jets there at number 10. They have Garrett Wilson, and then they have Mike Williams got signed there, but who knows if he's healthy? I know you're not a Mike Williams guy, so I'm just singing to the choir here at this point. I think Bowers could walk in and immediately be the number 2 target for Aaron Rodgers, immediately see 115 to 120 targets. We've seen guys like Robert Tonyan have double-digit touchdown seasons with Aaron Rodgers. If you give this is all contingent on the Achilles being okay, Rodgers staying healthy, and those are 2 big ifs. If Rodgers is gone, that landing spot looks horrendous. But ultimately, should we assume health for Aaron Rodgers, I'd love to see Bowers land there at number 10. I think that would be a phenomenal spot. Do you like the Jets, or do you have any other teams in mind that you could see Bowers landing at that you'd really enjoy?
I like the Jets, and I think it's like pretty realistic that he lands there as well at 10. Another team that I'm pretty interested in is Indianapolis. Just adding in Anthony Richardson, Michael Pittman, Josh Downs, Jonathan Taylor offense. I mean, that's a very complete offense. I mean, assuming that Anthony Richardson is still doing what we saw him in flashes last year and can stay healthy, that's a complete offense, if you ask me. And that would be pretty exciting. I mean, the target competition is more aggressive than it would be than it would be in Los Angeles. But I mean, still, I think they're going to move at a really fast pace. I think they're going to score a good number of points, and I believe in Anthony Richardson as long as he can stay on the field. And he didn't really show us anything last year to not believe in him. I mean, he was doing him in those first couple of weeks. I mean, people thought this guy was going to break fantasy football for a 3-week period and thought he was going to absolutely dominate. So I don't want to draft like scared of Richardson getting hurt. And if he becomes part of this offense, I mean, I personally haven't done a big dive into like the scrambling quarterback usage of their tight end. So you can like probably make that argument that like maybe like just because he's a scrambling quarterback and doesn't want to check down to the tight end, but like Bowers is going to get his if he ends up in Indianapolis. I mean, he's a target earner. He's, like you said, probably the best prospect general relative to their position in this entire draft class. I mean, you can make the argument him versus Caleb Williams, but he's an elite tight end prospect, clearly the best we've seen since Kyle Pitts. And I don't think you can really make the argument that he was a better prospect than Kyle Pitts, but I mean, that's just one man's opinion. But outside another team is my very own Cincinnati Bengals. They hold 18, pick number 18. That would require a catastrophic slide for him to get there, but I've been seeing a little bit about them trading up, and we'll talk a little bit about perhaps like a Bengals trade involving a star receiver a little bit later on. But a package, it wouldn't be a massive package to trade up from 18 to wherever to grab Brock Bowers. So I don't think it's entirely out of the picture that he ends up in Cincinnati, which would be a great landing spot. I'm not expecting that. I'm expecting him to go to more in the 10 to 15 range, and I don't think Cincinnati is going to make that trade, but it's certainly a realistic. So I think outside of Los Angeles, my top spots that are also realistic would be New York and Indianapolis.
And I think I'll add on to that Indy take real quick before we move on to some other receiver openings that really intrigued me. Of course, Anthony Richardson getting hurt would likely reduce this offense as a whole. The explosive, it certainly would. It wouldn't likely, it would. But you got Joe Flacco behind him, and we saw Joe Flacco as soon as Deshaun Watson was hurt and PJ Walker experiment ended. David Njoku was the number one tight end in fantasy football when he had Joe Flacco throwing him the ball. And I'm not saying he'd be better with Joe Flacco, but he might be, just because the offensive, we've seen how Shane Steichen, it worked with Gardner Minshew last year. He does craft his offense to his weapons at really, really well. And so this more run-centric offense would probably get opened up. They run some of the most plays in the game at a really fast place. And they this dates back wild that Joe Flacco has loved to throw to his tight end. So ultimately, that's why I like Indy. Yes, because it's great if it's Anthony Richardson as QB, but if something does happen to Richardson, I could see Flacco being just as good, potentially even better for Bowers' fantasy value should he be there. So something to consider. And it certainly buoys the floor there with Bowers there in Indianapolis. Well, we have about 150 of you here with us. Love to see it. Thank you so much for having your pregame with us so far. We're going to keep mowing through these, but if you could take a quick second, hit that thumbs up button. If you enjoy what you're hearing, like, shares, retweets, all that stuff does really help us grow. We got some good comments coming in already. We'd be happy to answer any questions you've got in terms of Bengals fans wish list is all O-line all the way down. And this is a deep, deep class. And I totally think, Jaws, that's very fair. They should, if they're sitting there at 18, they're probably going to get a tackle that in most years would go top 10. I think that'd be awesome for the Bengals to beef up that offensive line. As a Bengals fan yourself, Mo, are you hoping they go line, or what are you hoping they do with their first round pick before we move forward with some of these other landing spots?
It's like really boring just because I'm like I just love fantasy football and just would love for the Bengals to add a piece, but it's looking like just for the team construction they need more depth at the offensive tackle, both sides of the ball tackle. Defensive interior, defensive tackle, and offensive tackle seem to be the most likely outcomes for Cincinnati at 18. And someone just popped in the chat, Trey Hendrickson to Chicago. I don't think that's going to happen.
Chicago wouldn't do that for the 9. I'd be stunned.
I mean, they just traded for a defensive end last year. They
Sweat, Montez,
yeah. I mean, like, I don't know, but we can talk a little bit more about Bengals trades later. But yeah, just as a Bengals fan, it's going to be a boring pick, but one that the team needs.
Yeah, and another interest, we were just talking about Bowers, so I'll toss up Jaws's other comment. Really interesting comments and scenarios, Jaws and Jay Grizz, that you guys are tossing out there. So keep them coming, and anybody else out there, toss in your wish list, toss in your questions. We'd love to continue to get these in there. Jaws mentioning Bowers, what if the Seahawks ended up trading up for him? I do think that would be a phenomenal spot as well. Yeah, they re-signed Noah Fant. He had 0 touchdowns last year, so I could definitely see that being a great spot. Now, he would have a good amount of target competition there between DK, JSN, Lockett. That's a lot of mouths to feed, and Geno Smith potentially being the guy that's feeding them. I don't know that that's the ultimate spot, but it is an offense that can certainly hum and sustain multiple mouths. That seems a little crowded for me to consider that an ideal spot. But I could see that working. It's certainly not the worst spot that Bowers could land there. Would you like to see him in the Seattle colors, or is that a little bit ugly for you?
This show does not take Noah Fant slander. We are Noah Fant supporters on this show. But, I mean, like you said, it just doesn't seem realistic. And even if it did happen, the target competition pretty brutal in terms of land. But, I don't really see it happening in general.
Yeah, me neither. And the most important is a couple beers, a couple cheers from Jaws, motivating me. Maybe as we break down this next round of prospects, a little early in the day for me to start cracking into the beers, but it is draft day. So if there's ever a time for a 4 p.m. Afternoon beer on a Thursday, it might be today. So I might sprint over to my fridge in just a second and crack one for you, Jaws. I appreciate the motivation here. We did want to talk about just a handful in kind of together here of offenses that would be intriguing spots to us and maybe who we'd like to see land there in terms of, they have established number ones, but they are explosive. They like to pass it. I think the Cowboys would be a awesome spot. 30 points per game last year was the best in the NFL. They were right toward the top in the league in pass attempts per game as well. In fact, they were the number one team with 37.4 pass attempts per game. And that was really with a first half of the season, they just were reluctantly running the ball time and time again. It wasn't until week 6 they really turned the burners on there. So I think Dallas, despite having a absolute target monster there in CeeDee Lamb, no way, shape, or form am I saying that Lamb would not be the number one. We know he is. He's the number 2 fantasy pick for a reason right now. But Brandon Cooks is there. He's nice. He's a good receiver. I could see him definitely getting pushed out to a more of a number 3 role, though, should the Cowboys ultimately dip into a round 1 or 2 receiver prospect. Now, we're going to talk about the Cowboys for a more specific position a little bit later on. I'd rather see them go after in round 2, but that could be an offense that could use a weapon. And even if it's maybe round 3, a guy I'm pretty sure you like him. I thought I saw him on our show sheet down here. I've been reading a lot about Ricky Purcell, and I think he would be a great fit here because they have the do-it-all guy in CeeDee Lamb. They have Brandon Cooks who can still take the top off the defense. And then what a lot of people consider maybe the best route runner in this class is Ricky Purcell. I think he would be a phenomenal fit with the Cowboys. The other 2 offenses, the Chiefs and Lions, I think we all know who we'd like to see go play with Pat Mahomes, so we'll talk about that in a sec too. But what about the Cowboys? Would you like the Ricky fit, or is there anybody else you prefer to see there?
Yeah, the name I was going to say was Ricky Pearsall.
Yeah,
they finally got rid of the dust ball that is Michael Gallup. Cooks is still in the picture there, and Jalen Tolbert's been. I was excited about him when he came in just because of like the profile and the offense in Dallas, but he hasn't really proved to be anything other than like the occasional field stretcher, like rotational receiver who comes in for some vertical routes. And so I think he can carve out a role in Dallas pretty quickly. And I mean, just as a very good route runner, as we've seen throughout his college career, and just that's what he's known to do. I mean, they don't call him Slick Rick for nothing. And we've seen his ability to make contested catches. I mean, he had the catch of the year. I don't remember who it was against, but it was one of those early non-conference games against some brutal opponent for Florida. But still, I mean, we've seen him do it all, and just like the route running ability, like I said, it's just it's so easy to carve yourself out a role if you're a polished route runner. And that's what Ricky Pearsall is. And that's why so many draft analysts regard him as one of the better mid-round prospects and just better general wide receiver prospects in this draft class. So I'm in, and the projected draft capital and like the needs for the Cowboys and what picks they have, it lines up to where it's realistic that he ends up in Dallas. And I would be thrilled if he ends up in Dallas. We've talked about Dak being a great value. I'm all over this Dallas passing attack already. So just adding a polished guy who's, in terms of his route running, NFL ready, he'll be able to get open. I would be pretty thrilled.
Absolutely. I would be very thrilled as well. He became the guy over the last like 2 weeks or so that the more I learned about him, the more I tried to bump my exposure to him over these last few rounds of best ball drafts. He became in that 140, 150 range, the guy I clicked on. Another guy that I had been drafting before him, though, a bit in that range as a rookie was Xavier Legette, who I think the Lions could be a really nice fit. We know Josh Reynolds is gone, and he had himself some really productive fantasy days. Marvin Jones is obviously long gone there as well. We know Amon-Ra St. Brown going to do all the dirty work, going to hit those layup targets, and congrats to him for that massive, massive contract. Well-deserved, well-earned. You do love to see it. But they're going to need another weapon there. Of course, Sam Laporta probably going to be the number 2 regardless. But there is still plenty of passing volume with Ben Johnson's offense, one of the most pass-happy over expectation. Yeah, they do love to bleed the clock when they get up big and pound it out with Montgomery. And they are a bit balanced in that sense, but they are very, very smart with their pass attempts, and they do like to throw it in the red zone. So I think a big body guy like Xavier Legette could be a great, great fit with the Lions. I know a lot of the analytics guys don't really love him either. It's a really mixed bag on Xavier Legette where, there's some metrics that don't look great, and then there's some metrics that maybe this guy just didn't have the right opportunity. I do think, though, that big body style guy with a little bit of speed, too, could be a really, really nice fit for the Detroit Lions. I do want to talk about the Chiefs. We've been kind of building them up as well, but is there anybody with the Detroit that you think is a nice natural fit there before we move to the Chiefs?
I don't mind Legette. I mean, it makes sense just like in terms of a prospect profile, like big body type of guy. And that's just like a role that is needed in Detroit. I mean, yeah, like you said, they had Reynolds last year, but Amon-Ra doesn't fill that role. Laporta is great. And like you said, whoever comes in will be the third option more than likely. And the thing with Legette, it's just so strange. I mean, he's really old and didn't do anything until he was a 5th-year senior. And it's just that definitely is going to hurt his draft capital. Most people expect him to go in the 3rd round, maybe the 2nd round. So it works out for him to end up in Detroit. And a lot of people expect the Lions to take a mid-round receiver. So like the draft capital versus the needs and like what we expect Detroit to be doing in this draft, it lines up, and it's going to take some convincing for me to get around on Legette. I talked about him a little bit. Like I was a little bit more in on him earlier in this draft process, but now I'm just like the red flags are just becoming darker and darker red for me. Just the fact that he didn't do anything until he was 22, 23 years old. So it's concerning. And then, yeah, obviously the Chiefs, and that's just a whole mess of a situation, just in terms of how long is Rashee Rice going to be suspended. Like there's obviously available volume there. Schefter's now saying that it's going to be a multi-game suspension. So I'm expecting 2 to 4 games. So there's a chance for a rookie receiver to take on an early role, which isn't traditional. I mean, like, we more expect them to come on later in the year, but there's going to be opportunity for the Chiefs early in the year. Who's a name that you want to see in Kansas City?
I think it's a lot of people have connected this line, so I'm not unique with this, but the 4.24 speed of Xavier Worthy would be epic. And the more and more research I've done, originally I had A.D. Mitchell ahead of Xavier just because of the more prototypical size and freakish athleticism. But then you look at the early breakout age and the yards per team target pass attempt and all those analytics. Every single one of them favors Xavier Worthy, and it's not really very close in any of those measurables either. And he's far more. In fact, the more it's obviously you get the Tyreek Hill, the smaller guy, the speed, and you can draw those parallels. I am a little concerned because Scott Barrett talked a lot about how he was actually one of the worst deep threats, one of the worst conversion rates on deep balls, which kind of seems counterintuitive. And maybe it was the quality of the passes. Maybe he is just not that good in contested situations. But I think he also was using that point to illuminate that this is not just a one-trick pony either. Most of his production was coming on screens on the intermediate range where a lot of the bread is buttered at the NFL level. So I think Xavier Worthy, especially because what is Marquise Brown at this point? He's had some very intriguing tape, but then also last year was a disaster. So it really could be a situation Xavier Worthy could walk into either way, speed with Mahomes and an offense that's willing to sling it and give him a chance. I couldn't imagine a better fit. I don't think he's going to last all the way to 32. I think somebody's going to take a stab at that speed before then. But, man, I'd love to see Xavier Worthy. I think that would be the best fit for him and certainly the best fit for Mahomes because they already have Rashee Rice who can work that intermediate. They, of course, have Kelsey. So getting a lid lifter of that type of speed would be I would love to see that. What about you?
I think, yeah, like just the Tyreek Hill comp to Xavier Worthy, it makes him like the most like it gets you the most excited. So yeah, from the wish list perspective, I know I've been kind of going down the more realistic perspective for a lot of these picks, but I like Worthy. It just like mentally it makes sense. Like they kind of you saw that they needed that field stretcher type last year, and they obviously brought in Marquise Brown, Hollywood Brown this offseason, but as I've been like looking more and more to what Hollywood Brown has actually done in the NFL these last couple of years, I'm not sure like if the role that Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown would be playing in the Chiefs offense would be overlapping too much. I think Xavier Worthy would be able to carve out his own role, and as obviously the role that he would play would be like the vertical guy. He wouldn't be really doing anything else, like probably some screens in the absence of Rashee Rice, or some of that short work, allow him to get the ball in his hands in open space. So I think the one to get you most excited would be Worthy because we've seen what Mahomes has been able to do, and obviously Andy Reid plays a big role in that as well, what they've been able to do with that type of profile of a receiver. And there's a reason that not many receivers with that size, speed profile succeed in the NFL. I mean, we see failure after failure of these smaller guys who are just really, really fast. And Andy Reid made it work with Tyreek Hill, and Patrick Mahomes played a big role, and we've seen Mike McDaniel make it work with Tyreek Hill, and obviously now he's like a more established receiver. But if there's somewhere for Xavier Worthy for him to land and it to be a smash success, it's definitely Kansas City. So that's where I'm looking for him to go.
Yeah, and I just wanted to toss back out to the Lions real quick. I know I threw out Xavier Legette, but I should have. If we're talking about big body, touchdown, red zone type of guys, I don't know why I didn't just toss out Keon Coleman, who I do have 4 or 5 spots higher in my rookie receiver ranks. I know he's been hated on. I know the 40 time was very unappealing. But then you look at this fact that when he was running receiver drills and catching the ball very smooth, looked great with it. Also clocked in at 22 miles per hour, was one of the fastest wide receivers on that type of metric too. So I do think he's getting a little unfairly dinged these days because of that 40 time. And I'm a fan of Keon Coleman. I know CJ, one of our lead rookie guys, loves Keon Coleman as well. So he's another guy that I think would be a great fit. I know there's the Kelvin Benjamin comps too, and I just don't think that's fair. I think he's significantly more athletic than him. So even more so than Xavier Legette, I'd love to see Keon Coleman go over to the Lions. I think that would be the dream wish list, but one of those two big body type of guys that can make some touchdown noise would be exciting. Do you have any quick thoughts on Keon Coleman before we move on?
I was gonna make a tangent thought on Keon Coleman before we get moving to the running backs. Talking Keon Coleman makes me want to bring up Johnny Wilson, his teammate, and it's hard to really say it's hard to talk too much about it before we see where he goes, because he's projected to be a mid to late round guy, like 4th, 5th round. So it's going to be highly dependent on landing spot, but this guy's a monster. He's like 6'6.5", just absolutely enormous, and played alongside like I mentioned earlier. Like we can get down into this rabbit hole of like receivers production eating into one another, but it'll be highly dependent on landing spot. But if the team that he lands on like has some opportunity available, or just like a bad receiver group, he's one name that I'm going to be wanting to keep my eye on. And he's definitely gotten some steam from the best ball community in the last like 2 weeks to a month. So it's definitely not an unknown name, but he's one guy that I will be having my eyes on in terms of their landing spot in the next couple of days.
I know, yeah, he was going. Even in one of our drafts we did, I think we got him at 240 with our last pick when we had the number 1 pick in one draft, and now he's been going to the top 200 or so. Definitely getting steamed up, definitely worthy. There's so many other names. I mean, we could go on and on with this class, and I think a lot of it will be after some of those names you already heard us talk about will be landing spot dependent. I love Malachi Corley. I'd be very intrigued. What if the Rams going on that, and you get to see how Sean McVay would use a weapon like that? He certainly is very landing spot dependent. He needs a coach that's going to use him the right way, but I don't imagine a team will draft him without a clear vision of how they'd like to use him. So I have him right in the top fringe 13, 12 wide receivers in my ranking. So I'm very intrigued to see where he goes. I'd love it. I know the Rams doesn't seem like the most open opportunity, but we've getting those injuries there with Cooper Kupp, and he's another year older. Maybe that's there. Then you've of course got the other Washington guys, McMillan, Polk. Which one's there? Jermaine Burton. A lot. I know Scott Barrett. He had him right as a fringe top 10 guy in his prospect rankings. One of my favorite analysts to read, coming from some great pedigree there. Javon Baker transferring and then dominating at UCF after being buried. There's just so many. It's such an intriguing class. I cannot wait to see Devontae Walker, Malik Washington. There's so many names to continue to track there. We just gave you a little taste. But before we move on from the receiver position, the only other thing I'd love to talk about is a couple of veterans we could see on the move, and that's T. Higgins, who is still apparently looking to get moved, and Brandon Ayuk continues to have his name circled around as a potential trade candidate. I don't believe Ayuk, they keep talking about every time that his name comes up, John Lynch saying all we want to do is sign this guy to a long-term extension. I don't really buy that he's going to get moved. I think T. Higgins also is probably going to stay put too, but ultimately this is the wish list. If they're not going to be, I honestly think, certainly with Ayuk's case, I don't know that he could go to a spot and actually gain too much value. Of course, the Chiefs, the Bills, like there are a few spots that I just don't see, the 49ers actually trading him to because of how dangerous that would make him. But if you could see these guys going anywhere, where do you think they could land, and where would you like to see him land?
For Ayuk, I think the most likely landing spots, the ones that I've been hearing about from legitimate sources, is Pittsburgh. I've heard a little bit of Carolina, maybe something involving that early second round pick that they have. So neither of those are particularly intriguing, at least to me. I mean, as a fan, if you're a fan of one of those teams, obviously it'd be exciting, but from a fantasy perspective, that doesn't seem super exciting. I'm kind of on the same page with you. I don't think either of these guys really get moved. I mean, both front offices, they're different, but they've been made it very clear that they want them there. The Bengals, in the sense they want to hold on to T. Higgins one more year to make that playoff push with him, or that Super Bowl push. Playoff push would be disappointing as a Bengals fan. That Super Bowl push as with one more year with T. Higgins on the roster. And Ayuk, they've said, who knows if it's legitimate or not, but they've said they want him to be a 49er for his entire career. Who knows if that's realistic in terms of the money and what Brandon Ayuk wants to do. I mean, it'd be really insane if they're able to hold on to all those guys. So we'll see how things shake out. I think Ayuk's the more likely of the two. I don't see the Bengals trading Higgins unless it's some sort of blockbuster deal, and I don't really see it happening. The Bengals don't really have a history of making those blockbuster draft day trades. So we'll see. If anyone is going to get moved, I think it'll be Ayuk out of the two, but I'm still hesitant. But it's also just so hard to predict these draft day trades. I mean, there's some of them that are easy, like the JJ McCarthy moving up for him for the Vikings. There's some of them that are more predictable in your mind. But for me, these trades that involve star players, it's really hard to spot where they're going to come from.
Absolutely. And before they had signed Calvin Ridley, I did see a lot of dot connecting with T. Higgins going over there with Callahan, who came from the Bengals and is out there. Because they had the money as well. But now that, all that money to Calvin Ridley, you also have DeAndre Hopkins. I don't see it happening now. Would have been intriguing had Ridley not ended up there. Of course, the best spots are the Bills, are the Chiefs. These explosive offenses, especially the Bills. As much as I would love to see any of the receivers, the rookies, go there, I would much rather even see a guy that we know is dominant like Ayuk, like Higgins, has an NFL pedigree already established, even better. But I just can't imagine either the Niners or especially the Bengals. They're not going to trade within the AFC to one of the bigger threats for that Super Bowl push. Maybe Ayuk, but I just don't see it happening. But man, that would be so ridiculous if the Bills somehow landed either one of these guys. And I will just say too, if either of these guys did depart, especially T. Higgins for the Bengals, either one of these teams, though, 49ers and Bengals, would immediately jump up to a top 4, maybe even top 3 landing spot for a rookie wide receiver behind, again, that dream spot of the Bills. And then maybe right there, of course, they have Jamar Chase, but maybe right there behind the Cardinals and Chargers, maybe even a little ahead of the Chargers. If the Bengals have that open type of target share, it would be beautiful. And man, I'd love to see, again, Lad McConkey, a guy that already would be a great slot fit for them, but a guy that can also do it all. He would be we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's all speculation at this point. We're going to move on now to the quarterback position. And again, we keep getting more and more people with us. We love to see it. Thank you again for pre-gaming. Josh, he had motivated me to crack open a beer. Love to see it. Thank you guys so much. Keep getting those comments, those questions on in. Those thumbs up really do help us continue to grow. If you do like what you're hearing on YouTube, Twitter, wherever you're coming in from, please do consider helping the show out. But thank you again so much for being here with us. I don't think there's a ton to talk about at quarterback. We kind of know who needs a quarterback, and not a lot of those spots are overly sexy, and we kind of don't have much intrigue. I do think Caleb Williams to the Bears, that is a pretty loaded team now between Keenan Allen, between DJ Moore, and maybe even this rumblings that we see in our comments there, Jay Grizz mentioning too. Rome Odunze is often getting mocked there as well. I mean, you have that type of trio of weapons. Caleb Williams would be in such a great spot. Their lines a top half of the league. Their defense isn't too shabby either. It's very rare that a rookie quarterback gets to just walk into a job at the top of the draft that is this. It's crazy to talk about how well supported the Bears are right now, but they do have a really nice foundation in place for Caleb Williams. So I think he's going to walk into a great spot. And as long as he's as good as everyone thinks he is, and he's got the talent, that's a no-brainer. He's your quarterback 1 in Dynasty. Then, of course, you have Daniels likely going to Washington, but now a little steam that maybe it's on him. I sure hope they don't take him because I'm a Pats fan, and I'd love to see Daniels fall to us at number 3 because I don't know about Drake May, but that is where I want to go. Let's assume Daniels is gone at 2. A lot of talk is that the Vikings, that the connecting of the dots with Josh McCown being the high school quarterback for Drake May and now the quarterback coach there with the Minnesota Vikings, there's a lot of rumblings that they're really going to make a heavy push. They have the 11, the 23, maybe next year's first to try to move up and go get Drake May. And man, that is the ultimate spot for a quarterback, in my opinion. Really the only big glaring value hole that we don't know who's going to be going there is this Vikings job, given that Kevin O'Connell, one of the most pass rate over expectations in the league, a creative offense from that Sean McVay tree. We saw Nick Mullins averaging over 300 yards as the starting quarterback there. This is Nick Mullins. So whoever it ends up being, whether it's Drake May, maybe it's J.J. McCarthy, a lot of the rumblings at 5, they're going to be walking into an amazing spot because, of course, you can't forget the fact that they're throwing to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, T.J. Hawkinson when he gets healthy. I mean, this is a loaded spot for whoever lands there. I dare I say whoever it is, whether it's McCarthy or Drake May, is probably going to be a top 15 quarterback, whichever one it is. Me personally, of course, there's a little bit more fantasy juice, in my opinion, with Drake May. I know you're a Drake May fan based on some of our earlier drafts. You got the cannon arm, the mobility as well. The Josh Allen comparisons aren't unfair, even though, again, I don't know that I love him or fully believe in the guy. But if he goes to the Vikings, whoever goes there, I'm going to believe in, given the supporting cast, given the offensive system. And to me, Drake May would be the most kind of realistic best option, in my opinion. I do have a situation I'm going to toss at you after I hear your take on what you'd like to see go to the Vikings, because I have this out of the box thing that I could see happening, and this is a wish list. And man, I think it would be a bonanza if this unfolds. But let's hear what you think about the Vikings job, what you'd like to see happen there.
So I think, Drake May is the best scenario that I also believe is semi-realistic. And I swear if I hear some sort of Justin Jefferson mega trade to go get Williams out of you, okay.
No.
Okay.
Because then the job's not even that attractive anymore. If Jefferson's not there, it's not like anything. It's not Caleb Williams. Don't worry.
Okay. But Drake May, I think that's the dream scenario. That's also like semi-realistic. But it seems everyone's expecting them to go McCarthy, whether it be 5, 7, or just holding at 11. I've seen them mock to the Vikings at literally like every single spot, like whether they trade up to the Chargers, trade up to the Titans, or just hold at 11. I've seen them mock there everywhere. And like, I know there's some steam for JJ to the Giants at 9, or maybe even the Giants trading up to get JJ. But I'm assuming that I don't think it's a safe assumption, but I want to say that it's going to be JJ in Minnesota. And I'm not upset about that. I mean, like, it's hard to get upset about anyone. Like you said, it was Nick Mullins who was putting together quality weeks, but a couple of those weeks did come against, as someone mentioned in the chat, the leaky Lions defense. And that was two of those games where against a pretty shoddy passing defense for the Lions. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. But with those pass catchers, with Kevin O'Connell, it's just hard to not get excited. And obviously, JJ McCarthy's prospect profile has some question marks. Like, there just wasn't a lot of volume in general, not a lot of volume late in games, and just wasn't asked to do some of the things that some of these other quarterbacks were. But I mean, I hate to say it, but it pains me. Guy's a winner. He's an all-around football guy. I mean, like, there's not much. And when he was asked to make the throws, he did it for the most part. I mean, like, early in his career, he didn't always look great, but as he progressed, I mean, he won a lot of games, and he made the throws that were asked of him. And he did exactly what he was asked of him. So I don't see how you can be upset about the McCarthy pick from a fantasy perspective, especially given the offensive scheme and the weapons.
Absolutely. No, I think JJ could walk in, be a top 15 QB, the leader of men quality that everyone talks about, walking in on day one saying, if you're here to chase tail and get drunk, get out of this locker room. That's not what we're here for. We're going to do something special. We're going to return this program to glory. And he did exactly what he said. You read all those stories, and I like the guy. I respect a lot about him. So I could see that being great. Even if it ends up being Michael Penix at 11 or 23, maybe the best arm in this class by a lot of people's estimate. I know there's the injury concern, but he could have some real fantasy juice. Even, I don't love Bo Nix, but the guy can get the ball out. He's older and all that, but there's a lot of rumblings that the Vikings aren't the most likely to trade up because they are actually happy with Bo Nix and would take him at 23 and be fine. That could all be good and dandy. But the one type of potential blockbuster, I don't know that I've heard really anyone talk about. I don't think, again, I don't expect it to happen, but there is just a slight chance of this. Why not? It's always the Chargers in this trade conversation. What possibility is there that what if the Chargers gave them Justin Herbert for 11, 23, next year's first, maybe a piece of talent, and then the Chargers take JJ McCarthy, Jim Harbaugh's boy, at number 5. Suddenly Herbert goes over to pair up with Justin Jefferson and Kevin O'Connell's offense, one of the biggest gunslingers in the league, the cannon arm. I'd go nuts. I don't think it's going to happen, but in this dream, this is a wish list show. My ultimate wish list would be somehow, some way, Justin Herbert gets traded away to the Vikings for a ton of draft capital. Ultimately, they draft JJ McCarthy there with the Chargers, and it just becomes an aerial bonanza there in Minnesota. I mean, where would you rank Justin Herbert and also, of course, Justin Jefferson? At that point, would probably vault right back into number 1, 2 overall conversation. Should Justin Herbert be his conversation? I know it's a wish list. I know it's unlikely, but you could maybe see it, right? Like there's enough there that I'm surprised I haven't seen anybody even mention something like that.
I would be sent fully back down the Justin Herbert rabbit hole. I've been there, or whatever you want to call it. I've been there, the Justin Herbert whirlpool, whatever you want to call it. I've been there the last 2 seasons, and that would just be bad news for me. He just continues to disappoint me. Like, he gives me like 3 weeks in a row, or like a good month, and I'm like, yes, this guy is exactly what he's supposed to be. And then something happens, and he doesn't end up with that 5,000 yard, 40 touchdown season that I always convince myself that he's going to have. But I mean, if it had, like, Schefter was on some show last night, I can't remember, just talking about it, like why this wouldn't happen. Just like, there's like no team's going to want to take on that cap hit, but is basically what he said. But entertaining that if it does happen, I mean, yeah, that's my like number 1 quarterback wide receiver combo. Like, I don't know. I don't think Herbert would be the number 1 QB overall, but just like in terms of a duo, good God, like that would be terrifying. Herbert would obviously be flying up draft boards, and Justin Jefferson would move like from the 6 to like the 2, probably. I mean, maybe the 3. Like, that's the only thing kind of pushing him down into the number 6 area right now. So the fantasy world would go crazy, but I am in no way, shape, or form expecting that to be the reality when we come into the NFL, or when we leave the NFL draft on Saturday night.
Oh, man, we will see. I don't expect it to happen either. I'm not saying it's a wish list, but man, if it happens, I'm trying to think of who I'd rank ahead of Justin Herbert in that offense with that weaponry. I probably have him at quarterback 4 or 5, right around the CJ Stroud.
He'd be the number one pocket
ahead
passer.
of Mahomes. Yeah.
He'd be the number one pocket passer.
He is. Yeah, exactly. He would dice it'd be amazing. I would love to see that. Fingers crossed. I hope to see it happen. I'm with you. I don't think it's ultimately realistic because of the cap hit and the fact that they're trying to re-sign Justin Jefferson to this monster contract. I don't know how both those worlds could ever coexist. But man, it's just fun to think about. I would probably have him ahead of Pat Mahomes, just behind CJ Stroud, maybe even ahead of CJ Stroud at that point as my quarterback 4 or 3. We can dream. The boys can dream. So we've talked a lot about passing games, and we only have about 3 to 4 more really crucial value holes we'd like to cover here, looking over to running backs. But maybe the second most important value hole of all the draft, besides, I'd say, the Buffalo Bills situation, is the Cowboys running back situation. Now, I know the line has definitely taken a few hits here. Tyron Smith going over to the Jets. It's not as glorious as it once was, but I do think this is a situation that could be great for any running back to land in. And I think we're pretty aligned here and who we'd like to see land with the Cowboys. Why don't you wax some poetic on Mr. Jonathan Brooks here?
Yeah, I think Jonathan Brooks is the number one fit for the Cowboys, and I just think it's just because he's one of the only running backs that I think could be a true bell cow here. I mean, the two guys that could be true bell cows, in my opinion, were Blake Corum and Jonathan Brooks, and of course, both of those guys dealing with significant knee injuries within the last year or so. I can't remember exactly when Corum's was, but it was at the end of the season last year or 2 years ago now. But I think just because of the overall profile, I prefer him to Trey Benson. I think Trey Benson has a better chance to just be a committee back than Brooks does. I mean, obviously, like no one's super high on any of these running backs, and none of them are gonna go until like Brooks could maybe not even go in the second round. Like people wouldn't be insanely shocked if he makes it to the third round. So no one's super high on any of these running backs, and I think that's just like kind of a portrayal of the NFL landscape as a whole. But Brooks, I think he's not. He has a lesser chance to just end up in a committee, and he's obviously like a very talented athlete. We didn't get to see him test because of that injury, but we saw it during his time with Texas. Great a quality pass blocker in my opinion, and just an all around natural pass catcher. I mean, he's shown the ability to be a 3-down back, and if he can show that he can pass block at the NFL level, he's got the skill set to be on the field for all 3 downs. And it'll be highly dependent on where he ends up. Like if he ends up with the Cowboys and then dodges Zeke, like it's all aboard the train of Jonathan Brooks. I mean, we're going to be really excited about it. He's going to be flying up draft boards. So with all of these guys like being mid-round talents, it's really hard to say like what's going to be great now, just because it'll depend on where they land up. But whoever lands up in Dallas, it's going to be great, and it'll depend on what they split with potentially a Zeke type. I mean, like he just visited with them yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, and like I don't think Rico Dowdle's a 0. I do think Deuce Vaughn is a 0, but I don't think Rico Dowdle's a 0. So it'll be highly dependent on if they bring in another free agent in Zeke and how Brooks recovers from the ACL. But I want Jonathan Brooks to end up in Dallas. It's the most obvious hole for running backs, and I think he's got the best traits to fill those shoes and fill that hole.
Yeah, a team that averaged, again, over 30 points per game last year, the most in the NFL, would be a beautiful spot for anybody to land, especially Brooks. A lot of dot connecting. I'm sure some of you have heard the fact that their trainer was also the guy that did the surgery on Jonathan Brooks. Everything's checking out that he's expected to be ready for training camp. I do think he probably comes around a little slower to take that featured workload, regardless of who's there, whether it's contending with Rico Dowdle, whether they do ultimately sign Zeke, which I'm expecting, but type of guy that by mid-year, once he's fully ready, fully go, just like we saw kind of Breece Hall last year by midseason, ran for 500 yards across his last 3 games. There's a world where he just goes bananas down the second stretch where you really need those type of guys. And then dynasty-wise, plowing forward as maybe a top 5 type of running back. One of my favorite Scouts film guys, Matt Waldman, actually said, without that injury, if this was last year as well, he would have had Jonathan Brooks in the same tier as Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, thinks that highly of him. Dwayne McFarland, who's running back prospect model, he's talked a lot about on his recent podcast how great of a hit rate it is, even without factoring in draft capital. He said that Jonathan Brooks has been a top 10 prospect across the last 3 years for him, and anybody that's graded out that way, over 80% of them have finished as top 12 running backs in fantasy. So a lot of the guys I really love to listen to, love to read and trust, have really high grades on Jonathan Brooks. I personally love watching. He is so smooth. Waldman had a comparison. I don't even know if you were watching football back in these days, but Cadillac Williams, I don't know if you remember him way back in the day out of Auburn. Oh, man. Did you ever watch him and Ronnie Brown together, or is that way too old for you?
The names are there, but like actually watching them play, no, I don't remember. The only reference I recall to Cadillac Williams is just like From the League, like that fantasy football show. One of my like favorite comedy shows that like I'm sure a lot of people have watched. Like they talk about him like being the flex, like Caddy Williams. Yeah, I know the name, but yeah, that's a little bit before my time.
I know you got to also run really quickly too. So I'll just share quickly my first year of ever playing fantasy football, way back in like 2005, I believe it was 2006, freshman in high school. I got roped into a league with my buddies, and obviously the monster has been born since then. I drafted. I like to watch both those guys at Auburn, and I had the tail end of the round one. I took Ronnie Brown and Cadillac Williams as rookies, and both went nuts in their new homes. The Cadillac Williams comparison, and when you look at Jonathan Brooks, they're just so smooth, and the way they move through the defense, and they have underrated power. They're not huge guys, and yet they can run you over, but they often don't have to because just you watch the guy, he is just so butter smooth the way he changes direction, cuts. Like I love watching him play. And then as soon as he said Cadillac Williams, I got that little nostalgia of my first ever draft pick that I made in fantasy football, Cadillac Williams there. So I would love to see that type. I know he didn't ultimately last long. He tore his patella, and then his career was cut pretty short. So I hope that does not happen to Jonathan Brooks. But when he was healthy, Cadillac Williams was a delight to watch. Watch some of his old highlights from Auburn, and you'll see maybe why the Jonathan Brooks comparison. So yeah, I think that ideal fit, even if it's a little bit more of a slow start. If it's not him, we did talk about Trey Benson, 4'3" at 220 pounds. That's like Jonathan Taylor and Breece Hall level of size, speed, nightmare. Not nearly the type of runner in terms of vision and inside running quite yet, but he's got the feet, he's got the pass catching ability, so he could even step right into the Cowboys and be a day one monster as well. Those are the two guys I have a tier above the rest of this class, and maybe Brooks a tier above even Benson himself. I would love to see either of those guys land there. For my own personal selfish reasons, I know I texted you this as well. I have about 40% share of Audric Estime over these last few days, just because I think he is the one true bell cow of this class that truly can do all three downs, that has the goal line type of equity, that, he ran like a 4.7 at the combine, ultimately ran a 4.58 as pro day, probably meet somewhere in the middle. But, Arian Foster ran a 4.7 too and was an absolute animal for so long. I really like him. The Kyron Williams comparisons, he comes out of Notre Dame. They clearly have a type, and clearly it's worked out. It's an outlier, and you're betting on outliers, never a good move. But selfishly, just given the teams I've been drafting, I could see him walking into the Cowboys and immediately getting 15 to 20 carries a game and being a beast. So that's my own personal selfish one. But Brooks, Benson would bring so much more juice.
That's how Estime pays off. He just finds himself in a spot where he can either it's open like Dallas, or a bad enough running back that he can make him carve out 15 to 20 carries a game. If he can do that, he's going to pay off big time. It's just like he's just one of those guys, like you got to pray for volume. And the Dallas is one place that if he ends up there, he's probably just going to be handed volume. So I would be very excited if I were you as well, if Estime ends up there. But we don't need to talk too much about him. He's just going to be one of those highly dependent on landing spot guys. So he'll be talked about pretty heavily, I'm sure, once the draft wraps up.
I know. Fingers crossed he goes somewhere where he can at least get a goal line role, if not a significant carry share. The only other running back spot I consider truly difference making right now, and there are some spots with volume available that we'll talk about, they're just gross teams though overall, but the Chargers, we talked about receiver and tight end being huge openings, but running back as well. The Greg Roman scheme, as we alluded to, top 3 in carries every single year of Greg Roman calling plays. There is going to be a massive pie. Yes, they signed J.K. Dobbins recently. We know, obviously, Gus Edwards, somebody, if you've been watching any of our shows, we've drafted a ton as that Thunder that could probably have another 12 to 15 touchdown season, going at 130. I still think is a beast. But I think unless Dobbins really comes back from that Achilles, which we've seen really no one do, Donta Foreman kind of, but it took 2 years. And has he really ever been an animal? I don't know about that. So ultimately, there is definitely a potential lightning complement here to Gus Edwards' Thunder. And I do think Trey Benson, we talked about him just a second ago, but again, 220, 4.39 speed, can catch the rock as well. He would be the ultimate lightning fit here. A lot of people have mocked that as well. There are 2 other running backs, and I know you like one of them, and I like the other one just a little bit more. That could be a great lightning prospect, and I know you probably have to jump after we go through that, but who would you like to see with the Chargers?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit Jalen Wright before we get out of here. I think he's one guy that pretty early on was overlooked, really. And then he, within the last month and a half, 2 months, he's kind of picked up some ground. And I think Dane Brugler has him up to his running back 4. And so he's starting to be recognized as a legitimate prospect. And I think people expect him to go 3rd, 4th round. So I think that's the dream situation with the Chargers, obviously, other than Trey Benson. I just don't expect them to go running back. I don't expect them to end up with Trey Benson. But I think Jalen Wright would be a great lightning complement, like we've talked about. And why I like Trey Benson is that, or not Trey Benson, Jalen Wright, is he's that explosive type. But I also think he's just a good enough all-around runner to just take away early down work as well. I think he can easily eat into the. I'm not scared of Gus Edwards. We were drafting Gus Edwards just because of the role and the offensive scheme. There's a world where Jalen Wright ends up in Los Angeles. Gus Edwards still gets 10 plus touchdowns and pays off. So it's not the end of the world if Gus Edwards and Jalen Wright ends up there. But back to him, I think he's obviously a great pass catcher, and I just think he can develop a 3rd down skill set. He doesn't project to be an early down type of guy, more of a committee guy on long running downs and passing downs, but he's explosive, and I think he's a quality enough runner to get some of those early down looks. So it's another guy. It's going to be dependent on a landing spot, but if he ends up with Los Angeles or even another team that I put down for Jalen Wright was I would be thrilled if he ended up in Las Vegas too. So either of those guys or either of those teams, I just like Jalen Wright as a prospect. I think he's going to be an exciting guy. It's I think the most likely outcome for Jalen Wright is he ends up as a committee back. I don't really want to comp him, but just the similar role to what Jalen Warren has. He eats into the early down rushing work sometimes, but he's more often than not comes in on 3rd down, 2nd and long type of deal. That's what I'm hoping for with Jalen Wright in Los Angeles or Las Vegas. Just regular touches is what I'm looking for. And I think if he ends up in either of those spots, I think that's a really realistic outcome. And with talent, I think he can continue to eat into the workloads of Gus Edwards and Zamir White, respectively.
I think he's a great call, especially with the Chargers as a lightning complement. I saw this in Dane Brugler's beast. 26% of his carries, Jalen Wright's, went for 10 or more yards. That is a crazy explosive run rate. 30 total rushes of 10 plus more, 19 of 15 plus. 4.53 yards after contact on average was absolutely absurd. And yes, I saw Scott Barrett had some great stats as well about how he faced a light box on 75% of his carries because of the way the Tennessee offense operates in terms of the way they spread you out. But I also heard some counters to that in terms of how once they realized the quarterback there, I know Tennessee, the guy has a cannon arm there, but ultimately is pretty garbage. They would just load the box up a bit more, even if it looked less stacked in terms of the ultimate alignments. Teams were just starting to load up from afar there. So I think there's a little bit of a give and take there. So I think Wright would be an awesome fit. And he also ran 10% of his routes from the slot. You don't put your running back there for 10% of the routes if you don't have faith in him. I know he didn't have a ton of receiving production, but he did run far more routes than just your typical sit there and dump it off to me type of role. So yeah, I think Jalen Wright would be a great fit. The guy I'd love to see, if it's not him though, is Marshawn Lloyd, who I have one spot ahead of Jalen Wright in my rankings, my running back 3 after Benson and Jonathan Brooks. 7 yards per carry, 177 elusive rating. Absolutely absurd. 41% of his yards came after contact. He had 18 targets. That was not great, but 13 catches, 213 yards, 17.8 yards per reception. Insane. The best of the Power 5 there as well. Just an absolute monster. When he was used as a receiver, I think there's absolute potential for him. He was also split out wide 10% of the time too. He had some great back shoulder catches. I had, of those 13 catches, 5 of them were contested catches as well, like a receiver making some absurd plays. He was just amazing. I think the kid's a ball player, comes out of USC, and just has not been fully tapped into as a wide receiver, has that lightning complement. Was Graham Barfield. He charts the yards created. I love that metric. I love Graham's receiving or the running back evaluations as well. So I thought Marshawn Lloyd brought a lot to the table in terms of metrics, in terms of tape. I think he would be a phenomenal complement there to Gus Edwards as a more lightning type of guy that could eventually go into a 3-down role. So good through contact in one of the hardest hitting divisions. So I'm a big fan of Marshawn Lloyd potentially landing there.
The only thing I have to say about Lloyd before I get out of here is, like, I was listening to Pat Crane the other day, his show Ship Chasing. They were like asking why Marshawn Lloyd wasn't getting on the field and getting touches, and it took me back to Joe Goodberry, a Bengals guy. He just like talks about just the Bengals in general. A great guy to follow if you're a fan. But he was just talking about running back prospects. Marshawn Lloyd has something like ridiculous. He's fumbling every 32 touches.
It's a very fair award. Absolutely.
Like, I don't know how that stacks up against, like, historically, but it's by far the worst in this class. And, like, I was taken aback when I saw the number. It was either 32 or 36. Right? I don't have the number in front of me. It was like a month ago when he tweeted about it, but it was a ridiculous number, and that's why he's not getting on the field like regularly in college. So if he can hold on to the ball, like it seems like it's like one of those things where if it's a problem early on, just like the coaches are gonna hate it, and like he just might be buried before he can even get going, just because like the fumble stuff. Like some coaches care about it more than less, and like we don't need to get into this rabbit hole, but like it's definitely one thing that can and will keep Marshawn Lloyd off the field if it continues to be a problem, because that number was staggering. Like every 30 times he's getting the ball, he's fumbling. Like it's kind of ridiculous. But that'll wrap it up for me. I got to get going. I know you'll talk about a few other guys, but I'm looking forward to next week when we break down what actually happens in the draft, talk about why Devontae Walker getting drafted by the Bills is the greatest thing that's ever happened. So we'll get really gritty with it next week, talking about all these landing spots. But I'm gonna have to get out of here. But I'm excited to talk about the draft next week.
Absolutely, I can't wait. Hopefully, we have Best Ball Mania sitting there waiting for us on Monday. We can fire up our usual draft right off the jump. Can't wait for it. Thank you, Mo. Always love chatting ball with you. See you, brother. So I think I'll just address his quick fumbling take, which I think is huge and really well worth bringing up as well, because it could be one of those things where he has a couple early fumbles, especially if it was with the Chargers, the team we're talking about. Jim Harbaugh seems like the type of guy more of that Belichickian mode where you put the ball on, you don't protect the rock, you don't take care of it. Ultimately, you're on the bench. I could see that happening to him and ultimately derailing his career early, and then ultimately you're on the bench for 4 or 5 years. No one really sees what you have. We started to see it happen with Antonio Gibson, for example, in recent years. So that is definitely a fair call out. I'm hoping it's one of those things that we've seen some people that enter the league with fumbling issues get coached up and ultimately it goes away. But that is a very alarming red flag for him, and I think it's a very fair call out as well. Last guy I'll mention with the Chargers as well, it's an obvious connection, but Blake Corum, the Michigan boy, to me, it's a little bit of a redundant skill set. He's a great touchdown scorer. He certainly brings more juice than Gus Edwards, but he just doesn't have that type of extra lightning gear. The analytics really don't favor Blake Corum, who, if I was just watching the film, especially of you were talking about 2 years ago, Blake Corum, maybe the best running back prospect in this class, other than Jonathan Brooks, in my opinion. But last year, he just didn't flash anything special, despite having some great counting stats throughout his entire career. And I love the mentality, the intangibles of the guy. I can't, go dump on at all. I think he's a very, very just hard, can't measure heart, but he's got it. Like that is absolutely true. And yet when you look in terms of like yards created, in terms of yards, total yards per touch on the offense, there's just so many elusive rating, all those different things. He's towards the bottom of this class. And then you look at in terms of the last 5 classes, he's towards the bottom of that as well. So it's that weird, mismatch of like some interesting tape and certainly some great tape a couple of years ago, but then his performance last year definitely left a lot to be desired analytically. So yeah, maybe he could be. I do like Corum. He's my running back 5 in terms of my overall running back rankings. I tweeted out my running back rankings just yesterday, also at Roto Street Wolf in terms of my receiver rankings as well. So if you want to check out those overall rankings, those are there for you as well. But yeah, Blake Corum could be a volume machine, whether it's with the Chargers, if that Jim Harbaugh connection comes through, that could be interesting as well. I would just like to see a little bit more lightning go there to complement the Gus Edwards Thunder. The only other spots we talked about running back prospect. I love him where I want him to go. That's Audric Estime. He's my running back 6. He's really been rising. A beastly man of a just 3-down skill set. He just plows through people. There's a highlight run where he hurdles 2 people in a run. He's got some nice athleticism. He is a man, a bull of a runner, 94th percentile in terms of his rushing grade when you look at different metrics there. So I'm a big fan of him. 4.3 yards after contact, manhandling with SEC competition. I mean, you look at Ohio State, Clemson, like these big front sevens, and Estime was just bowling over a ton of them. And he has agility. It's not a guy that's just a big bowling ball. I am a big fan of Audric Estime, and I think he could do some real damage if he lands with the Cowboys or a spot where he could just eat volume. More likely to probably be a handcuff to somebody, but then, even if let's say it was Kyron Williams' handcuff, the Notre Dame connection, he goes to the Rams. Sure, of course, it's Kyron Williams' job, but something happens to Kyron, I could see Estime walking in there and being an immediate top 7 running back. So I'm very intrigued to see where he lands. In terms of other spots that do have volume but aren't overly sexy, the Giants, Devin Singletary, the only guy atop the depth chart right now, got a decent contract, probably going to be the lead back, but certainly not someone could overtake him is what I'm trying to get at. Carolina, Chuba Hubbard, your only competition there, definitely played well down the stretch. Showed he could be a feature back, then averaged under 4 yards a carry. This is Chuba Hubbard, not a guy I'm overly thrilled about. And I do love Dave Canales. I loved how he fed Rachaad White. That is a spot. If they continue to beef up that line as they did, they keep adding weapons. I could see Carolina. I don't believe in Bryce Young much myself, but they're doing the right things right now. And if Bryce Young can take that next step, then maybe this offense does turn the corner and the lead back there could be valuable. So whoever lands there is something to know. And then the Raiders, I think Mo mentioned Jalen Wright potentially going there as well. Only Zamir White right now, who I do like. I am a White fan. The way he finished the season as a top 15 running back in 3 straight games showed he could shoulder a big workload. Does have a very impressive athletic profile himself. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Zamir White leaves the draft as the lead guy there, but somebody could definitely earn some opportunities and ultimately take that job if they land there with some high draft capital. So those are a few other spots to watch. And that really wraps up, again, the wish list. We talked about the Bills. We talked about the Chargers, both from a receiver perspective, but also tight ends and running backs there as well. We talked about some of our favorite rookie prospects. Wolfpack, if you have any last-minute questions, get them on in. Any last-minute comparisons or takes on players that you want me to get at, let me know. I know Jay Grizz, I don't know if you're still here, saying Goff is a fraud no matter how you slice it. I don't buy that. I mean, I guess real life-wise, can you actually win the big one? I don't know. I wouldn't put my money on it. But fantasy-wise and in real life-wise too, I think he is the type of guy that can consistently get you into the playoffs, consistently give you a chance to win. And fantasy-wise, I think he's one of the more underrated quarterbacks going right now, quarterback 14, 15. He's going to finish in the top 10 quarterbacks. I'd almost guarantee it. I think they're only going to add more weaponry to him. One of the best lines in the league. Maybe you don't believe in the guy, and mentally in the big games, I don't know that I buy into him either, Jay Grizz, but fantasy-wise, I'm all for Goff. I think he can sustain good fantasy monsters, and I think that he himself is a quality fantasy option as well. And it's also because, as you mentioned, the Lions have a leaky defense. He's going to have to keep throwing, especially when they face another solid offense on the other side of things. So I don't buy that Goff is a fraud, at least from fantasy. Real life-wise, maybe. It's certainly in the biggest of games, maybe. But I think you're downplaying Goff. I think Goff is better than you are giving him credit for. Alrighty, Wolfpack, that wraps up our comments, our questions on your way out. If you don't mind hitting that thumbs up button if you liked what you heard, please do consider supporting your boys. You can check out all our coverage at rotostreetjournal.com. I'm going to be churning out new rankings as soon as these rookies have landed. Going to be writing up my favorite spots, my favorite players as they find their new homes. Cannot wait to be tracking this all. And most likely, assuming that Best Ball Mania or whatever tournament that Underdog has up their sleeve is ready to go, on Monday, me and Mo will be back at 4 p.m. as we always are for yet another draft. I cannot wait to see how these ADPs shake out when the rookies have found their home. So if you like what we're talking about, you enjoy the show, please do consider joining us on Monday at 4 p.m. as we cover some of these rookies and then hit a draft. Thank you again so much for being here in a world full of fantasy sheep, guys. Be that wolf. Until next time, later. Enjoy the draft. Let's go. Big night, baby. I'm so fired up. Let's go.